About a week ago, I asked you guys to share some of your hot Elder Scrolls takes in a community post. You know, the kind of stuff that could potentially get you downvoted on Reddit. I know, like really hardcore stuff. And I thought it would be fun to do a bit of a reaction, discussion type video, looking through your replies without having planned my responses beforehand, just to kind of have a conversation and see what you guys are talking about, if we agree, if we disagree, if I'm completely off with my takes. And before we get started, hi, my name is Angelika, and this week the scrolls have been beckoning for a bit of controversy, so here we go. So there isn't really a particular order to the kind of comments that I will be responding to. I picked from some of the top comments, I picked from some of the comments that had absolutely no reactions, and some in the middle, just to make it interesting. Something that will come as a surprise to all of you. In a shocking turn of events, most of the hot takes were about Skyrim. I know, crazy. Unheard of. So I think what we'll do is just get started immediately and see what you guys had to say. I'll do my best to pronounce all of the usernames, but if I pronounce your name wrong, I will not apologize. It's not my fault that you made things difficult. Up next we have Wally saying that the adoring fan isn't actually all that annoying. Gamers just hate children. Or maybe y'all are just committing to the bit way too hard. I don't know. When I finally did the arena questline, I wanted to see just how annoying the adoring fan was for myself, and when he said golly, all I could think of was a 1950s paperboy being rewarded a soda pop for a job well done. Golly, mister, thanks. We also call him kid when we tell him to get lost. He is a child in my mind, and I find him a little endearing. He's my little buddy, and I tell him to wait outside the caves for me. Plus, at least you can actually push him out of the way. I love Lydia, but damn, she is incapable of moving out of my way when we are in a narrow passage. And honestly, he hasn't been annoying to me at all, and I've done 2 additional questlines with him following me around. He's really not that bad. I also tend to have unpopular opinions about the Elder Scrolls characters, especially the unpopular ones. Okay, so I actually think that the take about gamers hating children is really interesting and possibly not too far from the truth, but I'll explain. So basically, just on that point with gamers hating children, I don't know if anybody remembers this content, but like, it was usually maybe Call of Duty YouTubers or sometimes GTA or even Minecraft making squeakers angry content. Like videos about pushing a literal child in a game to the point of tears or this rage where they would scream their house down and like get their mom to yell at them. It would often be a YouTuber that's like himself maybe 18 or 19 years old, and he'd get into lobbies with like these 12 or 13 year olds or maybe even younger kids, and yeah, just make them really angry or trick them in some way to like make them upset. And I remember the comments on those videos, and like everybody would like laugh and it was super funny, and everyone would just hate on the kid. And you know what? When I saw these videos, I myself was a child, so maybe I didn't think of it that way, but as an adult, like watching that content, I would probably think, that's a little mean. That's a little too far, you know? I don't know, I just can't imagine myself like spending time making little kids angry, like their brains aren't even fully developed. I don't want to make content out of that. That would just feel a little bit mean. So the fact that it was in the gaming space, I can see that like gamers hate children take, especially if you do view the adoring fan as sort of like a childish figure. My issue with this take is that I've never seen that person to be like childish. For me personally, I always saw it as a little bit of a sinister thing. So you compare it to somebody in real life who develops this infatuation or a parasocial relationship with some celebrity or some YouTuber that they really like. So, you know, they become completely obsessed, they dedicate all of their time to watching their videos, to leaving really long comments, sending them emails, following them everywhere, talking about them all the time, thinking about them all the time, and we've heard stories of that like ending really badly. It's the same reason why you would discourage things like simping. You know, sometimes you'll see somebody in the comments and they just take it way too far. Like, I think it's one thing to compliment a person, or if you're a guy, to give a compliment to a girl on a YouTube video, like, you look pretty, I love the way you dressed in this video. Like, I get comments like that. But when you get like, I don't know, a love letter or something like similar to how the adoring fan speaks, can I shine your shoes or whatever. If another person reads this as well, like a third person, you feel a little bit embarrassed for them, but also a little bit like, it's kind of too far. Like, you do not know this person. And the adoring fan does not know the grand champion personally. They just know their work. Going back to like the real life examples, there was a YouTuber called Christina Grimmie who was actually killed by one of her fans at a concert. This was a person that stalked her, found her, and then went to a concert and did that. So, you know, you might have seen them in her comments before, sending her like really nice things and really lovely messages and maybe like love letter style messages as well. But then it all just turned really sinister. And this one's a little bit of a personal one for me as well, because I've actually had an experience like that, where somebody became very infatuated with me through YouTube videos. They would send me a lot of messages, they would interact with all my content. The type of messages that they would send me were always like very passionate, there was a lot in them, and it's a person that, you know, I've never interacted with them. They don't know anything about me outside of my videos. And then suddenly it turned sinister, they had to be blocked. So, you know, there were a series of threatening messages, they created videos for me, it like went way too far. It was honestly a nightmare. So when I see somebody that's like overly positive, overly fanatical over a YouTuber, I don't like it. I think it's too much, and I can see that there can be something sinister behind it, or that it could eventually end badly. So that's my reason for like being uncomfortable with the adoring fan, but also people just hate him because I can see the annoying side too, like he is a little persistent, just if you don't consider the sinister side. And I think the developers themselves kind of hinted that his infatuation in particular could have had a sinister side, because later on when you read Cicero's diaries in Skyrim, he mentions being a fan of the Grand Champion and later killing him. So he kind of like posed as a fan, but then he did end up killing the Grand Champion. And even though it's not the same person, it can't be, even just, you know, you say like Bosmer, because he's a wood elf, they live for a really long time, but Cicero was an imperial, so it's definitely not the same person. But just the concept of like being a fan of somebody, or being able to put yourself in that position of being really fanatical over somebody, and then it ends tragically. I think on that same note, that's probably why, like, all that hate towards the adoring fan as well. Danelle says that Oblivion's voice acting and dialogue isn't quirky and endearing. It's awful and embarrassing. I'm just gonna say it, hard disagree.
What? That really pisses me off.
Oblivion's voice acting, though it had a very limited pool of voice actors, I thought was actually really well done, really quirky and really interesting. I think it's a huge part of the charm of Oblivion, a huge reason why all the memes are still around today. And also, I've seen awful voice acting in games. I know the difference. I don't know if anybody here has played Mortal Kombat 1, so the latest one that came out, but Megan Fox voiced one of the characters in it. And honestly, I don't know how they let that happen. I remember playing through the game and listening to her parts and thinking that it sounds like somebody that doesn't have any experience. Like, she sounded so bored when she was doing it.
People are no longer poisoned by sunlight. We've finally escaped the shadows. That blade's enchanted.
It was forged to destroy evil. It's slain many of your vampire kind.
We can't help what we are. That we feed on blood doesn't make us evil. Earthrealmers will soon know of Eternus. My realm starves, and it's coming here to feed.
This is the worst!
Like, just because you are an actor does not necessarily mean you can be a voice actor. Voice acting in itself is a totally separate skill set, totally separate talent to have, and yeah, she's just not it, or she needs more practice, but it really wasn't great.
You treacherous little filch! How dare you steal from me? What's going on?
So Colin here says, hot take, Skyrim was never actually great. It's an unfinished game to this day. An RPG with a terrible story, terrible characters, and almost no role-playing to be had. An action game with the most shallow button-mashy combat imaginable, where maces hit like swords, and playing defensive just means chug a lot of potions. Or cheese wheels. That works too. Skyrim's always been mediocre. So I think the first thing that I kind of want to address here is the comment about the combat, the shallow button mashy combat. Like, does anyone here actually play any Elder Scrolls games for the combat? I mean, unless you mod the game, like I've seen some mods for Skyrim that turn the combat into like a Souls-like style combat, but other than that, just with the vanilla games as they are, does anybody actually play them for the combat? Because personally, I've found it across the board to be clunky and just, I mean, it's not the greatest combat systems out of other games that I've played, you know what I mean? So like, I can see that, but also I feel like this is a thing that kind of everybody universally recognizes about Elder Scrolls games, that it's not something that you play for the combat. Now going back to the beginning of that, where they say that Skyrim was never actually great, I have to disagree. So in retrospect, right, when you look at Skyrim, when you've played through it, when you've played through the other games as well, yeah, it lacks in a lot of different places, and it can feel unfinished as well. It feels like a lot of stuff could have been elaborated on, which I'm sure we will touch on later on with some of the comments that I've pulled, but Skyrim definitely had its moment. To say that Skyrim was never actually great, in my opinion, kind of ignores the cult following that it has, the absolute boom that it made in the gaming community. Like, when you think about Skyrim, I remember even people that weren't huge gamers, but they would play Skyrim. Skyrim was a game that managed to appeal to a lot of people. Like, it felt like it had something for everyone, and yes, there are exceptions, yes, there are people that just hate games like that in general and they wouldn't touch them, but if you're into fantasy at all, like, generally what I've found is Skyrim will be the one game that those people would have played if like they don't play any games at all. I remember my first ever time playing Skyrim, discovering the quests for the first time, talking to all the NPCs, all the twists and all of the storylines. Honestly, I really enjoyed it. Like, I remember having a really good time with it, and I will admit, to this day, it is a game that I do revisit. Now, there are people that will say that thanks to the modding community, Skyrim can be great, but I'm actually somebody that doesn't play with mods, so for no reason in particular, I just really like games in their, like, vanilla or original states. I don't like adding anything to them. For me, personally, it has been like immersion breaking, but I do have an appreciation for mods in that I understand that thanks to the modding community, a lot of these games have been kept alive for all of these years, and it's just a great way for the community to be able to show love for these games. But I never played with mods, and I did think that Skyrim was great. I definitely think it had its moment, and right now even I wouldn't be, you know, too fussed about playing it on my PC, but I thoroughly enjoy Skyrim on the Switch, for example. I think the Switch, just for being such a comfortable console, imagine like a 10-hour flight, which is exactly what I did, like on a 10-hour flight playing Skyrim on the Switch. Fantastic experience, honestly, there's nothing like it. And I don't think that the characters are terrible. Sure, it feels like more could have been added in some cases, but I do think that Skyrim definitely introduced some very interesting and iconic figures for the Elder Scrolls franchise. And in terms of story, like I said, there were parts that I thoroughly enjoyed, especially in like my first few playthroughs. It was just a very interesting world to go through, especially because Oblivion was the first game that I played, so seeing connections being made from Oblivion, yeah, there's plenty of issues in retrospect, and especially if you compare it to stuff that came out afterwards. But honestly, Skyrim was great, and it did have its moment, and it's still a game that I can enjoy to this day. But I also think that it can definitely come down to personal preference more than anything. Moving on, the Elder Scrolls themselves are really boring and underutilized for the entire franchise to be named after them. They're just not all that interesting and are one of the last things I associate with the franchise, despite it being named after them. So this person is referring to the franchise being named after the Elder Scrolls, where we have seen very few physical versions in the games. And here's my take on that. I actually think it's kind of based. The fact that the franchise is named after this, like, almost unattainable thing, or this thing that's, like, really hard to get. Like, the whole heist quest at the end of the Thieves Guild questline in Oblivion, where you do actually get your hands on a physical Elder Scroll. Honestly, like, having the franchise named after that, you finally get it. It's not supposed to be an easy thing to get, in my opinion. I think that's like part of the charm. I also think it's kind of cool when it's like this thing that you don't really see. It's not a whole big deal. Not everybody's talking about it all the time. It's just like this very obscure object. You're not really sure what's in it either. And people that read them literally go blind. I think there's a whole lot of substance there, and I really enjoy that that's the way that it is. And I think that overusing them would almost take away from that charm. Skyrim didn't have the quality quest writing of Oblivion, in part because the dungeons were so much better that they could hold way more of the weight of a quest on their own, so the writing being good just wasn't necessary in Skyrim as it was in Morrowind or Oblivion. I'm gonna be real with you and I'm gonna say that I don't agree. In the sense that I think of like dungeons in Skyrim, particularly Dwemer ruins. I prefer Ayleid ruins to Dwemer ruins. 100%. And I prefer the Dwemer ruins in Morrowind to the ones in Skyrim. I think they were just better and more interesting. And I think maybe if you do too much of them, yeah, it can get boring. But when I played Morrowind, I enjoyed the dungeons a lot more than I did in Skyrim. I think that Skyrim didn't have the quality quest writing of Oblivion, not because of the dungeons, but just because it didn't. It lacked in a lot of areas, and we need to be honest about that. But I do not think that the dungeons are the reason. And there were some great parts in Skyrim as well. Like, I think Blackreach, everyone would immediately mention that. Blackreach is beautiful, but at the same time, the Dwemer ruin that you have to go through beforehand is not. I really don't like Dwemer ruins. Mass Attack says, fast travel is super convenient and I love that it's an option. You can still take your time and enjoy the journey if you so wish, but when you're playing the same fetch quest for the 6th time, it's nice to be able to skip the longer part. Yeah, I agree. Fast travel is a useful tool. I think it allows you to enjoy the game a lot more when you come back to it for the replayability, but I also enjoyed the way they did it in Morrowind, where they kind of built fast travel into the world as opposed to you just clicking into something on the map interface. So you'd either have to go to the Mages Guild and ask them to teleport you, or you could go to a Silt Strider or a boat. I kind of like that even more than just clicking on a map interface, but again, for convenience sake, I also can see why people like it. It's just that sometimes it's nicer when it's built into the world because it's just more immersive that way. But yeah, absolutely fast travel should be a thing, and you shouldn't be forced to walk everywhere all the time. Jaka says, Oblivion's Speechcraft minigame is the best persuasion system of all ES games because it requires actual player input and is not just a boring stat check pass-fail moment. Yeah, I agree. I think it is the most interesting system, especially if you compare it to like what you have in Morrowind. I was super confused with the Morrowind system. Like, I ended up giving away all my gold to an NPC at one point because it just wasn't working. I couldn't progress in the quest because I couldn't persuade them. And I also hate how you can give like 10, 100, or 1,000 gold, and you know, they get offended if you give them like a different amount at a different point. It's just too much work. I prefer having a system that you can kind of understand better, as opposed to just depending on your stats at the time. KG says, Oblivion hot take. Maybe there are too many dark cave and dark dungeon sequences. I did enjoy exploring on horseback in the overworld. Skipping on the fast travel option made it feel like a real adventure. I will say I'm definitely one of those people that prefers quests that are kind of like out in the world as opposed to in some ruin or some dungeon like far below the ground. Most quests or quest chains will involve you having to delve into some dungeon or ruin at some point or another, but I really like quests that kind of put you somewhere in a safe space as well, so somewhere like a town or a city where there's maybe some sort of an intrigue and you have to go around and talk to NPCs and learn more about them, sort of like the painting quest, so the stolen painting in Coral. That's probably one of my favorite quests in Oblivion just because you get to do so much of that. You get to gather clues, you get to talk to everybody, and if you don't know how it ends, you haven't done it before and you don't know who did it, the whole time you're there kind of guessing who it might be and you're making assumptions and accusations. I think that's way more fun than just going into a cave that looks exactly the same just in different locations all the time to retrieve an item or kill somebody and come back. Deka says, the huge lack of post-main quest content and impacts always make me hesitant to even play the main quest lines. They just feel so pointless and anticlimactic. You saved the world from an Oblivion crisis, here's some fancy armor and a title that doesn't really mean anything. Now, never speak to me again. It'd at least be cool to have some even minor quests dealing with the aftermath of events like the Oblivion crisis or Skyrim Civil War. It just feels like all the big events happen so quickly and there's no closure. Even something as small as like sitting in on an Elder Council meeting and helping decide which cities and provinces to give resources to rebuild, etc., even if that didn't actually have any in-game effect, would do so much for actually making it feel like the supposed major events had an impact on the world. Yeah, honestly, that's like a very big oversight on their part, in my opinion. It does almost make it seem like it's useless to do the main questline because it's of no consequence to anybody else in the world. All the other NPCs that just live around the world and walk around, they don't care. Like, yeah, the world almost ended, sure, but you know, they'll just keep doing their thing and discussing seeing mud crabs every now and again. They do not care about you or what you have done. It would have been nice to have like a different section of the game unlock as a result of you completing the main questlines, essentially the main story of the game. Something that only happens as a result of you being able to shut all the Oblivion gates and, you know, close that whole deal down. But yeah, it just kind of feels like everybody forgets about it when you're done with it, and you forget about it, so why would you do it again? Same with the Civil War, such a huge event, but other than like a few Jarls changing around the place, what is the real impact? Devil Beetroot Clips says, you kinda need mods for Skyrim. So I think it potentially is more of a hot take to say you don't. Because I more often hear of people using mods than not. And I've actually heard people say stuff like, Skyrim would be nothing without its mods or without the modding community. And again, I full-heartedly disagree. But that's just because that's been my experience. I just really enjoy games in their original state without adding anything from anyone else into it, just to play the game as the developers made it originally. Like, I've added mods before, but honestly, they kind of just take me out of the world. Like, if it's something that wasn't there before, if it wasn't something that was added in by the developers, yeah, I just feel like I'm taken out of the world. And that's just a totally personal thing. I'm not saying that it has to be that way for anyone else, but yeah, that's what I find. And it is a little weird because like the modding community in Skyrim is such a huge deal, and there are some fantastic mods out there, but I could just never get into them. Transcendent Lion says, Nazeem isn't that bad, and may actually be a tragic figure. His behavior points to him having once been a respected advisor to the Jarl, but he's suffered some disgrace and was thrown out of Dragon's Reach. Now, he doesn't dare to show his face in the Cloud District, is despised by his wife, and hated by the Dragonborn for no reason. Well, there is a reason, and I'll tell you what it is. It's the snobbery. It's having somebody that doesn't know you at all immediately look down on you without even putting in the effort to try and get to know you. The first interaction you will ever have with this person is them trying to appear like they are better than you by saying that you never go to the Cloud District. Of course you don't, you know? And sure, you could say that he developed this sort of an attitude as a result of all these sad things that happened to him, but we don't know that for sure. In fact, I think if somebody lacks humility in the way that Nazeem does, it's probably better that they're not in a position of power or somewhere where they can have some sort of an impact on other people's lives. Like, I could see Nazeem being somebody that advocates for the lower class citizens or the beggars to have worse conditions or not to be respected as much. He definitely needs to be humbled, and I humble him every time. I did watch a whole video on Nazeem, and I do not remember what channel this was, but they talked about how he and his wife both have keys to a non-existent house in Whiterun. So it's a house that was supposed to be in the city, but it was just never added, maybe due to time constraints in terms of development, or they just decided to scrap it for some other reason, but it's not there. So both him and his wife actually live in a tavern. And so from that perspective, you might think the snobbery comes from the fact that, you know, they live in this big house and they are privileged citizens of Whiterun, but you don't see that in the game unless you kind of dig into that background. Either way, regardless of whatever position he's in, the snobbery and the way he dismisses you, the way he behaves, it's just unpleasant, and meeting somebody with such a lack of humility, I find it hard to relate and to sympathize with them. ACHD says, I completely understand why it makes some people uncomfortable, but the racism in Morrowind and in Windhelm makes the games feel more realistic because it's supposed medieval fantasy and not a perfect copy of modern real-world politics and morality. But here's the thing with people feeling uncomfortable with that. media is supposed to make you feel something. A good movie, a good book, a good TV series, a good story in a video game, it's supposed to make you feel some type of way. A good, powerful story will often deal with topics that are uncomfortable, something that may not be pleasant to hear, but it isn't endorsement. Depiction does not equal endorsement. You know, you think about movies about World War II. I think uncomfortable isn't even the word, but at the same time, it's good to have a look and see how things were. It's educational, it's supposed to make you feel something, you know, there's a story there, and it's just good for people to know about these things, to know that they happen, to be educated on those things. And when it comes to these types of topics in fiction, it can make for a powerful story when you include topics that make people uncomfortable. That said, there are tasteless ways to go about things also. I don't know if you guys have heard of the infamous disturbing movie Iceberg, but that has a lot of stuff on it that is just absolutely tasteless. It isn't supposed to just make you feel uncomfortable, it's supposed to just shock you and disgust you, and I don't think that that's what a good movie or a good story should do. And sure, some themes can be disgusting as well, and it's still a good story, but those are straight up just to shock you and just to make you feel unpleasant. There's nothing you can take away from watching it. And I just don't think that that's the case in the kind of themes that are brought up in Elder Scrolls games and the way that they're brought up also. Like, when you do come across instances of racism and similar encounters in games like Skyrim, you can see that it's depicted in a way that, like, yeah, it's wrong. And you as the player straight away can see and derive that this is wrong, this doesn't look good, this is uncomfortable. It doesn't make you want to go out and be horrible to somebody, you know? And I mean, there's a lot of morally gray things that can be done in Elder Scrolls games. Like, I don't understand why they would bring up things like the racism, but they wouldn't talk about things like the Dark Brotherhood. You're literally assassinating people. And sure, you can tell me, oh, they're bad people. Not always. I think you have to be careful in criticizing those aspects of the game, because what is the critique here? And you know, if these things make you violently uncomfortable, I can imagine it's very hard for you to consume any kind of media. It's part of the world building, it's part of the story. There are 10 playable races in the Elder Scrolls. So, you know, it's interesting to see, well, what are the differences that these races have? You know, there have been so many wars between all of these races. It cannot be possible that there isn't a degree of contempt between them, that, you know, someone doesn't come out and they're not like racist to someone else from another race. Yeah, it happens as a result of all of these conflicts and other factors that we know through the lore and we know through the games. Steven Stone says, I really hope there's never a new Elder Scrolls game because I have no faith in Bethesda and the gaming industry to make it any good. But it's okay, Skyrim and Oblivion will live forever. And Morrowind. And Daggerfall. I don't even know if this is a hot take anymore. I think this is just like a generally accepted point of view when it comes to speaking about Elder Scrolls 6. I feel very similarly. I think that I would survive if they never released Elder Scrolls 6, because more than likely it is going to be a disappointment. Like, they've straight up told us that it's probably not going to live up to our expectations, and that doesn't give me a lot of hope when the, you know, developers say that. I think this comes back to the arguments that I made in my Why I Only Play Old Games video. Like, I didn't mention that there are modern games that are exceptions, such as Baldur's Gate, such as Elden Ring. There are, of course, exceptions. There are good new games that can come out now, but the issue is, when you have been around for a long time, when you've been playing games for a long time, and you want a sequel, you want a continuation of a particular story, I've lost all faith in that. I don't anticipate any continuation of any game. I'm worried about the Elder Scrolls 6, I'm worried about it ruining the franchise. That's like the main concern. It feels like there's almost no point to wait for any sequels in terms of new releases, because it's just going to be a disappointment. I know a highly anticipated one right now is GTA 6. The issue is, I think that people will be disappointed with GTA 6. Like, there will be things about it, and I mean, if I'm wrong, I hope I'm wrong, but very likely it's not going to live up to the crazy expectations that people have. And they have also been waiting years for GTA 6. Unfortunately, I think that sometimes we just have to move on. And I think that the Elder Scrolls 6 is probably one of those things that, even if we do see it, I don't know. I'd be okay with not seeing it, ever. Nico Laws says, I find the Redguards and Orcs more interesting than other races in the Elder Scrolls. Also, I just don't get the appeal that Bretons have since Daggerfall, because they are bland as hell. I think that people mostly like Bretons for their racials, for their passive racials, but yeah, I definitely agree with Redguards and Orcs being very interesting. I'd love to see them explored a lot more. Again, we just kind of talked about Elder Scrolls 6 and how I don't have a whole lot of hope for it, but say we do miraculously get a good game. I would love to see more about Redguards and Orcs. I'd love to see more of a focus on them. I think in Skyrim, one of my favorite things was the Hammerfell garb or the Redguard outfit. Just like seeing that on them, seeing that part of their culture, like they look so different to the other NPCs in Skyrim. That's super interesting and I really want to know more. I really want to see more. So yeah, for sure, I agree. And also, Bretons, I mean, yeah, I've also found them kind of bland. Honestly, I never really play Bretons either. I think that the best looking Bretons that we had in Elder Scrolls were in Daggerfall. I kind of briefly mentioned that in my beauty standards in Tamriel video, but other than that, I don't even notice them, to be honest. Bart Holt says, Elder Scrolls 6 ain't going to be good and we should just rip that band-aid now. Yeah, again, I don't even know if this is a hot take anymore. I honestly think that this is just a widely accepted opinion at this stage, which is unfortunate, but it's the reality that we live in. Robin says, the courier boy is actually the person writing you the from a friend letters. I think that's super interesting, especially if you consider the fact that the courier somehow always finds you. Like, how's that possible? You know, if you think about it logistically, like, oh, you just happen to be where the courier is in the world at the time, and, you know, they have, like, a message to deliver to you, which usually is, you know, pretty, like, on-time message for you. So, how do they know where you're at? How do they know to find you? The Super Ginge says, Oblivion has the best character creation of any game ever. In no other game have I been able to give my character a concave face. Have you ever played The Sims 3? I always associate The Sims 3 with Oblivion because I feel like there's a lot of similarities, just in the same way that, like, they're both super colorful games, and the create a sim versus, like, the character creation of Oblivion, they're very similar in, like, how ridiculous you can make people look. But yeah, I agree, and what I like about the Oblivion character creation is that there isn't too much there. Sometimes I think the character creation, and this is probably a very unpopular take, but sometimes I think there's just too much in it, you know? And I'm somebody that appreciates more options for, like, hair and things like that, and maybe that's somewhere where you could see more elaboration, but just, like, excessive body sliders and all that, making your character's butt bigger or smaller, I don't know. It's just not my thing. Just let them have the butt that they have, the default butt, and I'll be happy. Like, I don't mind. I wish for, like, more focus, definitely maybe on hair options. That's something that it definitely lacked. Like, I don't think that Oblivion character creation was perfect, but I did like it. Just, it's kind of simple. There's not a whole lot you really need to do. And at the same time, there's enough that you can do with it to make your characters look different, even if they do look like potatoes at the end. Munto says, getting married in Skyrim is very underwhelming and could have been incorporated in a much better way if they put some more thought into it. And here's the thing, I feel like that can be said about a lot of things in Skyrim, that it's just underwhelming. But yeah, definitely just on the topic of marriage, they for sure could have done a lot more with that. Like, I don't know, it's just, it's so limited. And I'm not saying that it should have had the same, like, Baldur's Gate level of, like, romantic interactions. Now, I actually haven't played Baldur's Gate 3 myself yet, but I know all about the romance system because everybody was talking about it. And I don't know if Skyrim would have benefited from that same system, but to have more interactions and to have more nuance and just more in general would have been so interesting, and I really would have enjoyed it. As opposed to just coming home and, like, you get, like, one home-cooked meal a day and a little bit of money. It just feels so cold. Also, I wish you could choose who you invite to your wedding. I don't like some of the people that show up. Just because I did something nice for you doesn't mean I want you at my wedding, you know what I mean? Here's one from Master Neloth. I don't like Oblivion that much. I'm in shock. I felt that it strayed super far from a lot of the lore in game, and according to Michael Kirkbride, it was solely to mimic the Lord of the Rings as much as possible. It did away with the jungle concepts and cultures like the Nibonese and Colovians. I also find it jarring how all the elven races have the same voice actor, even though they couldn't be more different. They twinkified my poor 16-pack smoking Dunmer. I think the story, cities, and some DLC are good though. I think that people have different opinions on this, depending on which Elder Scrolls game you started with. So if Morrowind was the first game that you played, or anything before Oblivion, Morrowind, Daggerfall, you will likely be of a similar opinion that you would have wanted to see more of like the jungle concept and having those cultures expanded, which they still could have done even without the jungle, but the Lord of the Rings-esque feel definitely made it more accessible. And I mean, Oblivion was my first game, so I didn't know anything about the Elder Scrolls universe or lore when I first played it, and it was such a welcoming introduction to the Elder Scrolls universe. But that's my perspective, that's my point of view, because it was the first game I played. Had you played Morrowind first, or had I played Morrowind first, and maybe if I was more aware of the lore, I would have had the same issues where they didn't develop it in the same way that I would have expected them to. There's other things as well, like Cheydinhal needing to have more Dunmer style architecture as opposed to like those European-esque Tudor style homes. So yeah, it's definitely a shame that they didn't explore that, but I didn't know about any of that when I was playing it, so I was fine with it. It's only now, in retrospect, when I know the lore and I've played the other games that, yeah, I can say it would have been cool to see that, but honestly at the time playing it, I didn't have an issue with it, and I already fell in love with the game, so I can't say that I don't like it, you know? As for the voice actors, again, I don't know. I still like it, but yeah, they probably could have done with a wider pool of voice actors for sure.
Oh no! What do we do? I'm so scared.
Breakfast YT says, I enjoy fighting cliff racers. Now that is a hot take. You know what? Here's the thing though. I think you start to enjoy fighting everything in Morrowind once you've kind of established your character a little bit more. In the beginning, I did not enjoy fighting anything. Combat in Morrowind was a nightmare. It was the reason that I dropped the game several times when I first started it, like years ago when I tried it for the first time. But I sat down when we started this channel and I started to really play Morrowind, and I did it on live stream, and I learned how to properly build up my class and my weapon skills, and you know what? Everything is enjoyable to kill when you're able to kill it. Jake Griffith says, I actually really like Skyrim's Civil War questline. Most people seem to dislike it, but while it could have been developed further, it was still a lot of fun to see my choice impact the game through changes in rulership of individual holds. I think that Skyrim's Civil War questline is possibly one of the best written storylines in Skyrim. Now, as a questline, especially when you're playing it for like the third or fourth time, it isn't my favorite questline to play through, but the story, like there's just a lot there. The fact that to this day, it can still be debated on so many levels, and I really enjoy that there was so much setup before you as the player are even dropped into the story at all. You've got the signing of the White Gold Concordat, you've got Ulfric's imprisonment, the death of his father, the murder of King Torek. Was it a murder or was it justified according to their laws as a duel? There's actually so much nuance there that to this day, you can make like hour-long videos talking about it and dissecting all of it and trying to find the moral sides from each part, and it's just so interesting. Like for example, if you decide to side with the Stormcloaks, you know, your reasoning behind that, why you agree with the Nords' fight against the Empire, you consider the genocide that's happening against Talos worshippers, you can make a lot of arguments for that being the good fight. And then you can look at it from the Empire's side, like if they didn't sign the Concordat and if they tried to withstand the elves and failed, so many people would have died, was it really worth it? And in the middle you consider things like, well, they sold themselves out. If they don't have, you know, their morals and those values, what do they have? Why would they just give up an entire belief system? They didn't even try fighting for it. There's a lot to dissect, and there are some really great videos out there that I would really recommend you guys watch if you don't know a whole lot about it and you just like want a breakdown or you want to see both sides discussed. I personally never skip a Civil War video on Skyrim. John says that Mankar Cameron was right. Tamriel is Lorkhan's realm of Oblivion. I think that's a really interesting one because you can definitely make an argument to say that, you know, Mankar Cameron had a point. You can kind of see a side of things, but it was not necessary to do everything that he did with Mehrunes Dagon, all that destruction. Oblivion lockpicking is the best. Yeah, it's my favorite interface for lockpicking, for sure. I prefer it to Skyrim's interface, and it's a very interesting system with like counting how many times it bounces to like get the perfect one. It's my favorite one. It's the one that I've most enjoyed in Elder Scrolls. But a really fun thing that Daggerfall has is when you approach a locked door and you try to interact with it, it says that this lock has nothing to fear from you. That's such a dramatic way to put it. I love it. Electric VGC says, people are wrong when they say that Oblivion was the biggest change for Elder Scrolls. Morrowind may as well be an entirely different genre of game from Daggerfall, and there aren't really any modern games that replace Daggerfall either. I mean, when you put it that way, yeah, the difference between Morrowind and Daggerfall is a lot bigger than the difference between Morrowind and Oblivion, even visually. This is why very often when you talk about Elder Scrolls games, people will just compare 3 games, and that's Morrowind, Oblivion, and Skyrim. So yeah, I would agree with that. I'd say that the biggest change in Elder Scrolls was the jump from Daggerfall to Morrowind. Chubby says that ESO is interesting but very boring to play. So here's the thing with ESO. I haven't actually played it, and that's because I couldn't commit to another MMO. I play World of Warcraft. I couldn't do this to myself. I don't have the time, I cannot commit, and if I'm going to play an MMO, it's not possible to fix me. I will always be playing World of Warcraft. But I do agree, like, just with what I've seen that was added on to the lore, I've seen some pretty interesting things, and I don't know if they're going to continue with that as being canon in the main Elder Scrolls games. Like, if they move on to Elder Scrolls 6, I don't know if they'll reference the things that are said in ESO in the same way, but there's definitely been some very interesting additions to the lore, additional lore on divines, the race of Khajiit in particular. They have a lot of interesting material there, and just loads of other things in general. But I couldn't get into it, and I tried it, and just in terms of an MMO, I didn't enjoy the way it plays. So because of that, I can't really comment on a whole lot when it comes to ESO. And that's why you don't see ESO content from me. Like, you'll see brief mentions of lore that was expanded on in ESO, but never a dedicated video because I don't know enough about it to make a dedicated video. And I think that that's all that we have time for today, but that was definitely very interesting to go through. A lot of these, I'm not sure if they're actually hot takes or if they're just like widely accepted sort of spicy opinions that people have, because I think a lot of people are just upset and angry, especially when it comes to things like Skyrim and Elder Scrolls 6. I think that the worst thing about Skyrim is that for many people, if it was the first game that they played, they will not go back and play any of the games beforehand. Like, they'll try Oblivion and they'll say, no, it's just too different from Skyrim, I cannot play it. So in that way, I think that Skyrim almost ruins it for some people. But because it wasn't my first game, I did enjoy it. I think it had its great moments, and it's not a bad game. I don't think you can say that it's a bad game. It was definitely a great game in its time. But this was really fun, and let me know if you guys would like more content like this in the future, where it's sort of more discussion-based video where we do a bit of a back and forth. I get some input from you guys. Definitely a little bit different to the typical videos that we have on this channel, but still very interesting to go through. Thanks to everybody that left a comment. If you're new here, be sure to leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Be seeing you. Bye.